Come light it up, I'm ready to go. Come light it up, come light it up, I'm ready to go. Come light it up,
Thanks, Jess. I'm Justin Borgman, co-founder and CEO of Starburst, and very excited to be here with you today hosting this panel on data disrupted. And before we get started, I would love for us to start with brief introductions. If each of you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about something that you're passionate about outside of work. That's probably the hardest question that I'm going to ask today. Martin, why don't you start if you don't mind?
Sure. So I'm Martin Casado. I'm a general partner at Andreessen Horowitz. I focus just on infrastructure, so I do a lot of data investing. Prior to that, I started a company called NextData. I did that for 10 years. And then prior to that, I got my PhD at Stanford in computer science. As far as passions, honestly, mostly I like work, to be very, very clear, but it has bled into being broadly interested in innovation and the history of innovation.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. Zhamak, why don't you go next?
Hi, Justin. I'm Zhamak Dekhani, and I'm the creator of Data Mesh, CEO founder of NextData, a data mesh technology company. Oh, what am I passionate about? It feels like a luxury to have a passion for something that's not related to work, between raising a child and starting a company. But if I have to pick something, it would be music. It just makes everything better.
Excellent. Playing music or listening to music?
Both of it,
Both.
yeah. Playing piano and listening.
Very cool. And Teresa?
Yeah, I'm Teresa Tung. I'm our chief technologist at Accenture for Cloud First, and I'm really charged with looking at the future of cloud computing, which is pretty much everything. What I'm passionate about, I think we're all workaholics, it sounds like, so I'm really passionate about sleeping outside of work as much as I can get.
Absolutely, that's a worthwhile passion. And I guess to round us out, I also struggled with this question. Not a lot of hobbies, but I do have young kids, and a passion that has surprised me is an interest in understanding farming equipment, because my son is very passionate about tractors, and that led to exploring every possible piece of machinery that I think exists on a farm. So if databases don't work out, maybe farming is next. With that, why don't we dive in? We're going to start with some hot takes. The topic of the panel, of course, is data disruption. But in particular today, we're talking about a couple of different concepts that have both introduced new approaches to helping companies become more data-driven. One is, of course, the modern data stack, very popular, and the other is data mesh, which is certainly growing in popularity. And we're going to get into a lot more detail on both of these, but to start off, I'd love for each of you to provide your own hot take on these two concepts. What's their potential? How are they similar? How are they different? Maybe Teresa, we'll start with you.
Yeah, modern data stack and data mesh are both in service of creating data products. That's what people care about at the end of the day. Do I have the information, the data I need to get my job done, right? So I look at modern data platform as something you might use to create data products, and data mesh also in the same. So at the end of the day, we're all trying to solve the same problem.
That's great. And Zhamak, of course, you coined the term data mesh. How do you see these two?
So modern data stack, as the name implies, is a technology stack. It's the unbundling. My observation is that it's an unbundling of technology that existed pre-modern data stack that was managing data and analytics and AI at scale in a more proprietary, monolithic way. With modern data stack, I see the unbundling that into individual technologies and applications that perform perhaps a function of the bigger ecosystem. But what they do is still, I think the technology, the way it's integrated and operates, it's still in the previous paradigm or existing paradigm of pipelining data from the sources and applications to perhaps warehouse and lake and layering it with knowledge and access and so on. So it's a modern technology stack applied to the paradigm of data processing as we have known it for a while. Data mesh, it's not a technology stack, it's an approach, it's a new paradigm to rethink this operating model within which we go from data to value. And that's a different topology. I guess the correlational relationship between the two, that the existing technology and the modern technology stack can be used and reintegrated in this mesh way of data sharing or peer-to-peer data sharing.
That's great. And Martin?
Well, after what she said, my take is a lukewarm take. I totally agree. So my lukewarm take is there's kind of a false dichotomy. Mm-hmm. The modern data stack is a technology stack. It's an emergent thing where people use technologies that if you look into the industry, you see. So it's a collection of technologies. It is not a framework to think about how to structure your operations or a roadmap for the future. The data mesh is a great mental framework as well as a set of technologies for how to think about data and provide a roadmap into the future. And so I think they're both very useful. I think they're both in play, but I think they're almost different concepts.
Yep. Well, we're going to start with a lot of agreement because I agree with all of you on that point. I think you can certainly deploy modern data stacks or other data stacks within a data mesh, right? And these are not mutually exclusive and certainly not a dichotomy, as you mentioned. I think that's important. So with that, let's dive a little deeper into the modern data stack. And in particular, Martine, you created probably one of the most referenced series of architecture diagrams for modern data infrastructure. I see this all over the place. A lot of people use these as reference diagrams, which is great. And would love to open with your perspective on what this diagram ultimately means. Maybe you could walk us through this.
Yeah. Okay, so there's going to be a few diagrams we go through. The first one is actually like a super diagram of all of them. So let me just explain where this came from. I'm an investor, very interested in what's going on in data, and there's just an awful lot of confusion, right, and the confusion is not just modern data stack or analytics, it's everything, like where does AI come in, where does ML come in, where does operational stuff come in, et cetera. And so what we did is we went out and we spoke to something like 100 practitioners, went across our entire portfolio and said, okay, so what technologies are being used? And we came out with, there's two primary use cases. One of them is the analytics use case, which I kind of view as like, it's almost like human in the loop, computer-aided decision. It seems to be centered on the cloud data warehouse. And then the more data science, ML type stuff, which tends to be a bit more batch, more compute heavy. So this unified data architecture is all of them combined. If we actually go to the next slide, I'll talk to. So analytics, modern BI, has evolved around the cloud data warehouse. I mean, that seems to be the vanguard of the trend. And so if you look, you'll see that the traditional cloud data warehouses like Redshift or BigQuery or Snowflake. And we are seeing an evolution to ETL as part of that, right? So you hear things like ELT, which says, okay, why don't we put everything in the cloud data warehouse first, and then we'd go ahead and do the transformations. A lot of the roots of the term cloud data warehouse came from folks that are using things like dbt and Fivetran and Snowflake. That's kind of a lot of the original was around analytics, but now it's been broadened to, I think, be like to be like rough framing for new tools that we use for data stuff. So multi-nodal data processing, this is kind of what the big data ecosystem has evolved to, which is if you have a lot of data, you've got compute heavy workloads. If you want to use both SQL and kind of other technologies, so a much more broad use of data, you'll have these more batch heavy solutions. And by the way, often you'll have both, right? But this one really focuses on the more batch heavy data processing. And then the last one, if you show the last slide, when we made this slide something like about a year and a half ago, and this has grown a lot. So this is if you're building a model that runs as part of your application, what does that stack look like, right? So this is kind of all the work to do the model, and then the feature stores, the feature serving, and the model serving in this stack. And so again, the unified data stack is all of them together, which very few people have all of them together, and then we break it down by the primary use cases and the dominant.
That's great. Thank you, Martine. And Zhamak, how do you think about these blueprints, the use cases described here, and how do they relate to data mesh?
Sure. Yeah, my initial reaction is the great articulation of the technology that's out there and how organizations are integrating that. What's going in the back of my mind is that, does Martine know that these diagrams often represent the data strategy of a CDO at a company? Like, people actually see these diagrams, and this is perhaps a slightly pre-data mesh, and if you ask, like, what is your data strategy, this is what you see, is that I've got to get an event streaming backbone in place, I've got to get a lake in place, and then shortly after that, what you end up is that this diagram will mirror your organizational structure, right? isomorphism between organizational structure and architecture, something, Conway observed half a century ago. So then you have application dev teams, which represent data sources, somewhat oblivious to where the data is going and how it's going to be used. You have the data teams dealing with the second architecture around the data pipelines and so on. And now you have ML team and data analyst, right? So then we end up with this functional decomposition of organization to get from data to value in almost an orthogonal way to the structure of the organization, right? So the value of the data. So I think that how it relates. So what data mesh does is says, well, let's look at kind of the macro level of organizational architecture from a domain perspective, from how the data can be embedded and used within the domains to give autonomy, and this functional technological kind of decomposition as a second layer almost. So then what you end up with is reintegration of these technologies in a mesh topology within the domains, and start decoupling this big data team and so on. But I think that the playground in terms of the technology is almost the same. Of course, we have now emerging technology around data mesh to make that experience a bit more native, but essentially this is the catalog of things that we're using.
I think that's an excellent point you made about how architectures can reflect your organizational structure, and that's certainly something we see even just in the development of software itself, that software can be built in a way that ultimately reflects your organization. Teresa, I guess turning to you, I'm curious, how does Accenture align to some of the concepts that we talked about here? What do you see your customers leaning into in terms of their own modernization efforts?
I mean, from a modern technology stack, if that's the interpretation, right? This is a dominant design, right? So the fact what Martine has created, this is, from an implementation perspective, a lot of what we see even the cloud providers aligning with, right? So if you want an ML ops pattern, you want a data engineering pattern, this is what we see you could buy very easily off the shelf with cloud. I think what's exciting about the data mesh concept is that you don't have to adopt a modern data stack. If, because of business reasons, it doesn't make sense to modernize right now, and your existing maybe legacy system is serving a purpose and creating a need, maybe that's an okay story. You don't have to modernize first before you get value, right? The data product in the legacy system, it's useful to somebody, somebody's paying for it. Could it be better? Yes. So if I wished all my data was central and mastered and modern, I would wish that. But in reality, that's really hard to get to.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. To me, that's one of the things that I like most about the data mesh concept is it reflects a very practical reality that many customers have, which is that their data is naturally decentralized, and this is a framework or approach to turn that into a strength ultimately, rather than a weakness. And I think that's interesting. Also allows for greater optionality as you can change the various components. You can be more flexible, more adaptable. On this topic of modern, another question that we wanted to talk about is, does cloud equal modern? I think very often these are treated as synonymous terms. And I'm curious, Martine, can you provide your perspective on if cloud equals modern?
So no, I don't think cloud equals modern. So in the history of the industry, we have these epochs, right, where there's a platform shift and it allows kind of retooling and approaches that are quite a bit different. So for example, in the case of data, the economics of storing a bunch of data changed with the cloud data warehouse, which made us think about it in a bit of a different way. And so we use new tools, right? So the way that I like to think about it is the traditional older kind of museum of computer science past data teams still exist and still have all of that complexity, and you need lots of traditional approaches for them. But now we have simplified platforms and we have new tools to use them, and that is more modern. And it's an operating approach, it's a platform approach, but it can be on-prem, it can be off-prem. I think that it's not synonymous with cloud.
Makes sense. And Zhamak, how do you react to the concept of the modern data stack, and if it still supports centralization?
Yeah, I think I touched on it earlier that modern data stack has definitely made it easier for us to scale out operationally. To me, the word modern means that we are solving necessary problems and we remove busy work out of the equation, as in we're not doing so much mechanical work that doesn't add value, and we're just working on what matters, like solving the business problems. And I think modern data stack creates a platform that you can focus on solving business problems. However, in my perspective, the structure of it and the integration of it and some of those toolings have been designed to work within the paradigm of data and move to pipeline and centralize and layer, like the technologies, that's how they have organized themselves. That's the ecosystem that we have. And that with that comes some extra work and challenges when we come to scale organizationally, sharing data organizationally across domains and across organizations. And I think we've got to kind of rethink how these technologies need to be reintegrated that can scale out and remove some busy work that is related to solving, fragility that gets introduced in the system by having people in charge of the data that don't know anything about the data, right? So I think we've got to kind of rethink about reintegration of that, perhaps with data mesh model or something after data mesh. I don't know what's going to come next. That really focuses on how would I give superpowers to people to work with data and just do what matters to the business and remove busy work or mechanical work that doesn't add necessarily value.
So if I can summarize that, is it fair to say that the modern data stack has brought new modern technologies to bear, but not necessarily modernize the processes of how we work with data? And data mesh is a new approach to that, really a new approach to handling decentralized data and providing greater autonomy to people in the organization. Is that a fair summarization?
That's my perspective.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me. And Teresa, I'm curious, you obviously do a lot of work with customers on this area. Do you find companies are starting to evolve to those more distributed data architectures and embracing maybe new approaches, not just new technologies?
Yes, and I would say that they started distributed, right? So they have different lines of business, they have partners. So face it, the data that they need to drive their business is distributed. It's a concession to reality. So if you've been approaching it with the purely centralized model, you're not going to be working and seeing data across the company or seeing data across your partners. So with that concession to reality, we see even the major cloud providers, it's thought of as a cloud continuum. It's not your grandfather's centralized cloud single data lake. It's going to be multi-site, even things at the edge, right? So it's the continuum of services that are hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, completely on-premise and edge. And really that's the future that we're looking at. And I think that's why I'm really excited about data mesh, right? Data mesh is really leading into that and addressing how do you operate through this concession to reality. Yep. It's always been there. So like it or not, they've already been distributed.
Yeah, I think that's exceptionally well put, and certainly what we see with many of our customers as well. I guess diving deeper into data mesh, which we've spoken about a bit so far, Zhamak, we're obviously excited to have you here today, having created the term, and would love to hear what you think about how the world is reacting to this concept.
Sure. If I just maybe start a little bit, talk about why and how we reacted to it, why I introduced the concept. I think from my observations, now it's a few years, 2018 was the very first time that I truly sensed the challenges that organizations had. At organizational level, we had created an operating model that wasn't scaling anymore, right? It was limiting our ability to get value from data because we had assumed that we've got to centralize data so that we can see cross-correlation and discover patterns within the data. And that at the organizational level, we had created a model that was no longer effective, and it was out of step, as you mentioned, with the reality of the business, which you have multiple organizations, units, and data off the platform and on different platforms and so on. So it came to exist to really challenge the problem of scale at the organizational level. And I think at societal level, what I sensed was this fear of an imbalance of power in near future, where our approach to AI-enabled solutions require collection and centralization of the data. And that would lead to the ability of, or to only a few people, only a few players be able to do AI-enabled innovation because they have access to the largest pile of data, right? So at best, we have this kind of data architecture that's somewhat ineffective, and at worst, we have a data architecture that's pathologically unfair. So I think it's just two levels that observation that kind of created the idea of the data mesh as a stepping stone. The reaction of the industry, I think on one hand, I'm thrilled and excited to see that it has become the thing that it has become. It was really a question. It was a first principle thinking that what principles or what assumptions should be a challenge. And on one hand, so I see widespread adoption of it and a huge amount of enthusiasm. On the other hand, I'm terrified of a religion forming and, misled or misunderstood implementations that can have quite a negative effect on people and organizations, and I feel personally responsible for it. So I think there's just both sides of it. I think we're going through a phase of having figured out almost what it is, and now we're trying to figure out how to build it, and we're wrestling the technology that existed to kind of fit it into this new model of working.
Yeah. Well, the good news is there are many of us who are happy to help those customers try to implement those solutions. And certainly, Teresa, you've done quite a lot of that at Accenture, and you've built a practice around this, and you've sort of assembled, what I believe you're calling the data mesh stack. Can you walk us through why you made this decision and what that means?
I wouldn't say stack, since we just talked about some of the technology implications of stack. We call them accelerators. So think about this as the muscle or some components that you could bring to bear. So we firmly believe you don't buy a data mesh, you're going to build a data mesh, and that means working with the client, so working with the business. The data team works with the domains. You work with your partners to create this together. And so in that spirit, some of the things that we can do to accelerate. So we can handle a lot of the plumbing, right? There's new components like the data catalog, like something like the Starburst for the query layer, like the access control, right? These are things that should be connected via metadata. When you make a change in your data product, you should be able to have that metadata event route to, let's say, the catalog so you could see the change. So some of this plumbing, the metadata connections, we already built with many of the tools that we might have seen in Martin's stack, as well as some of the legacy tooling, right? So that gives you a start. We might also have industry-specific data models. So if you don't know what a data product should be for your industry, well, most industries have the same sorts of entities. They might have the same sorts of data sources, right? So we can have those as accelerators where we've done some of that mapping. That said, this doesn't give you a data mesh, right? It's not a stack. We have to build this with the company. So this is taking that tech stack as an accelerator where you can start prototyping your initial data products. But what does it mean to be a data product? How do you change your organization? There's a person in that org whose job is to become a data product owner. They probably don't know that's their ambition or their job. They just know that they might be frustrated today because they don't have the information needed to get their job done, right? So a lot of that org change then happens, and that's part of that building. So it's not just the technology side where we have accelerators for those. We have some of the org roles that you need and some of the processes to onboard a product, to request change for a product, to promote access for a product. But all of this needs to be fit within the org and the tools that you already have.
That's great. I'm curious actually on one of those points you mentioned of the data product owner. Do you see that as a new role being created?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think nobody, again, I don't think they grew up saying, when I grow up, I'm going to be a ballerina, a fireman, or a data product owner. But certainly you see frustration today where you say, every new insight takes me months, right, to get. And so there's certainly data, you need to get your job done. So that is some of the things that data product owners should be thinking about. How do I actually continuously improve and get better data, faster data, more insightful data? Yeah.
I'm in complete agreement. I actually remember maybe 12 years ago or so when data scientist became a new term and a new role. And I think it was Jeff Hammerbacher from Cloudera at the time who had popularized that concept at Facebook when he was there prior to founding Cloudera. And I think similarly, we're at a new cusp, a new beginning of a new shift, and perhaps there will be new occupations on LinkedIn of data product owners. Martine, I'm curious, what are your thoughts in the context of your work around modern data architectures? How do you see data mesh?
So listen, this is a very complicated, fast-moving space, and everyone's confused. So like, if you're listening to this and you're confused, that's everybody. Actually, there was one thing when we talked to customers and to users and to operators, which was everybody had a slightly different opinion. They were tackling similar problems, and everybody wanted to know what everybody else was doing, right? Like, that was kind of it. So like, there's just mass confusion, and this always happens in times of chaos, and this always happens in times of architectural shift, which we're undergoing. And when these things happen, one of the most powerful tools for organizing the chaos are ways of thinking about architectures that are, as you said very well, come from first principles of solving problems. And like, data mesh very clearly articulates both, the challenges that those working on data have, and then ways to think about it, to fix it, and then sets of tools, like you said, to address that, right? And so my job coming into this discussion is, you can almost think of me as like an anthropologist or an archaeologist. Like, I'm just interested in what people are using, right? So I go, you all are the visionaries, right? And so I see what people are using, and we try and maybe provide a bit of guidance on what we're seeing, because we've got a large portfolio. And we do that, but it's almost backwards looking, right? This is kind of something that's emerging, it's interesting. What data mesh does, and has done very, very well, is articulates a path going forward that absolutely resonates with what we heard when we were talking to customers. And I think it's a very interesting way to think about how you evolve your strategy internally going forward.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Zhamak, I'm curious, could you talk about the concept of data products, which is such a pivotal element of a data mesh strategy, and how you see companies succeeding with that? Teresa mentioned the role of a data product owner and that evolution, and I'm curious, if you could elaborate a bit more on the importance of data products.
Yeah, so data as a product is one of the 4 principles of data mesh, and what it tried to do was invert the relationship that we had with data. We saw data as an asset. We're going to collect it. We're going to keep more of it. I don't share my assets with anyone. I don't know about you. But now it was, let's change that into data as a product that I take care of and then I share with other people to use, right? So focus on the usage of the data, the long-term ownership of the data, and all of the affordances that need to get packaged with that data so that it's discoverable, understandable, trustworthy, and so on. So with that shift, I think what happens in organizations is that first we are able to now put the focus on usability of the data, and then with that comes improvement of how quickly can I go from a hypothesis as a data scientist to get access to the data that I need, do my experimentation, and then move it to either yes or no, follow this hypothesis and build a product. So reduce that innovation cycle that we need, or lead time to innovations, because there's now long-term ownership, and these data products are domain-oriented. So this principle can't be just used in an isolation, right? It's related to the other principles. So you have this domain-oriented data product. So ultimately, I think having this long-term ownership, emphasis on the usability, accessibility, and reducing that lead time to access the data with this product thinking, we are trying to solve the time and effort that it takes to do data innovation. That's kind of the purpose of the pillar. And I know that data products have found a life of their own, independent of data mesh in a way, and there are many different kind of interpretation of that, and how we bring it to materialize it and implement it. I think that's going to be an interesting space to watch moving forward, because there's so many different interpretation of like what actually data product is. Mm-hmm. But fundamentally, it's the conversion of product thinking and data.
Agreed, and I think that's a very exciting future, and that's a great segue to the next topic. As we close the panel, we wanted to make some predictions. So we're at the beginning of a new year, and everyone loves to share their predictions for what will be the most disruptive in the data world in the year to come. Martine, maybe you could start. Could you kick us off with a preview of what you think will be most disruptive this year?
So I haven't a clue. But I know it's going to be an amazing year in data. So I would just encourage anybody listening to this to not think this is a zero-sum game. Like, this is kind of robbing from that, and you have to do this or that or like whatever. The reality is, even if you look at the macro environment, data is doing phenomenal. It's more central to organizations than it's ever been before. If I see 10 companies that come in, let's say in the enterprise app space, they don't differentiate on software anymore. They differentiate in data. The amount of changes that we all know that are happening in various aspects are, of a level we've never seen before. So it's just going to be, like 2023 is going to be an unbelievable year in data. That I know for sure. What it actually looks like, I don't know.
Very honest. Teresa, what do you think will be the biggest disruption this year?
Well, I think there's going to be bigger adoption of data mesh, including the, some of the more modern data stack to drive that. Some of the tools that people hadn't invested in as much before, let's say your data catalog, that might have been something dusty in the corner. Now it's really going to be a star if it becomes a data exchange, a data marketplace, right? The access control layers that you might not have done. Tools like Starburst, which again, maybe you didn't have before because you were trying to centralize everything, and we realized we can't do that. If we look forward, again, the next phase, I'm really betting on domain knowledge graphs. So if I use an analogy, data products might have been like what AOL was many years ago. We said, here's your weather services, your sports services, like this is what you need to have when you surf the internet. We were just getting into the internet. We didn't really know what it was or even what a web page is. Once we see what a data product is and it starts becoming pervasive and people start using it, we're going to see domain knowledge graphs, just like in web search. When we search for something today, like say Accenture, you actually see the map based off of where you're sitting. It's closest to you. It's contextualized. And so I see data mesh kind of the next evolution, adding that sort of semantic layer.
Excellent. And Zhamak, you just started a brand new company, which I have tremendous empathy for the journey you're about to embark on. What are some solutions you predict your future customers will want?
Sure. So we have early customers and design partners that we're working with and building the product with. And they all want the same thing. They want to have their cake and eat it. Is that the expression, have your cake and eat it too? Yeah, that's it. So they want to have their decentralized data, but they want it to be discoverable, they want it to be interoperable, they want it to be across organizational technology boundaries, they want all of that. So it's, even though it might sound simple and we have a lot of technologies on the slide for it, it's hard to get to that with a seamless and a native experience. There's still a large amount of effort and goes into the integration technologies in that decentralized bottom-up data sharing. So what we at NextData, we try to, I guess, strive to create is a catalyst technology that makes this experience of working with data in this peer-to-peer decentralized analytics as seamless and as native as possible. I think we are at the bottom of that hockey stick of introduction of a new technology when things get hard for a little bit and more expensive before it gets the value really materializes. And hopefully we're seeing technologies that put us at the top of that hockey stick and creates more effectiveness and efficiency working with data mesh, because there's still quite a lot of friction to operate in that model. We're still in the middle of like, let's decentralize, such as, we went through this decentralized IT, now we're decentralizing data, and it's, we need a set of technologies that can be catalysts in and create a very native experience from the origin of the data to applied ML or analytics.
Very cool. So I guess to finish with my own prediction, to me, one of the things that I think is very exciting about decentralized architectures and the data mesh concept is that it makes the data movement, the data ingestion, the ETL processes more of opportunities, more optional, if you will, rather than necessities before you can do any analytics. And so I think what that will open up this year is an increased focus on optimization. And when I say optimization, I don't just mean query optimization, which we've done for decades, but actually optimizing for cost and for performance and giving the opportunity to decide where that data is going to live. So it doesn't all need to come into one central database in order for me to do analytics. I now have the choice. And I think with the backdrop of the macro environment and the uncertainty, customers will become increasingly focused on how do I optimize my architectures, how do I get the performance and cost considerations I'm looking for, and I think these decentralized models give you a greater opportunity to do that. So with that, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Martine, Zhamak, and Teresa. And Jess, I'll turn it back over to you.